The auctioneer's gavel fell with a crack that echoed through the nearly empty county courthouse, and just like that, Marcus Webb became the owner of something no one else wanted. $300. That was all it took to purchase a crumbling stone fortress perched on the edge of Black Ridge Mountain, a structure so forsaken that even the local historical society had given up trying to preserve it. The other bidders, all two of them, had walked away when they heard the stories. But Marcus didn't believe in stories anymore. He believed in walls thick enough to keep the world out, and this place had walls 10 feet deep. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first time Marcus saw the fortress was on a gray October morning when the fog clung to the Appalachian peaks like a burial shroud. He had driven up from Charlotte in his beat-up Ford Ranger, the truck bed empty except for a duffel bag containing everything he still owned. The real estate listing had been sparse, almost deliberately vague. Historic stone structure. Remote location. Sold as is. No utilities. Cash only. The grainy photograph showed a hulking mass of dark granite rising from the mountainside, its single tower jutting into the sky like a broken finger. The road to the fortress was barely a road at all. It was a rutted dirt track that wound up through dense stands of oak and hickory, the trees pressing in so close that branches scraped the sides of his truck with a sound like fingernails on glass. The higher he climbed, the colder the air became, and the more the modern world seemed to fall away behind him. There were no power lines up here, no cell towers, no sign that the 21st century had ever arrived at all. When the fortress finally came into view through a break in the trees, Marcus stopped the truck and simply stared. It was far larger than the photograph had suggested, a sprawling complex of stone buildings that seemed to have grown out of the mountain itself. The central tower rose 4 stories high, its windows dark and empty. Attached to it was a long, low structure that might have once been barracks or a great hall, its roof partially collapsed. A curtain wall surrounded the entire compound, broken in places but still imposing, still designed to keep something out or perhaps to keep something in. The real estate agent, a nervous woman named Patricia who had insisted on meeting him at the base of the mountain rather than driving up herself, had given him the keys with trembling hands. She was in her 60s, with the kind of face that had seen too many hard winters, and when she spoke, she kept glancing up at the mountain as if she expected it to be watching her back. "The place has a history," she had said, her voice tight. "Built in 1887 by a man named Calloway. Josiah Calloway. Made his fortune in coal and timber, lost his mind up there on that mountain. They say he built it to protect himself from something, though nobody knows what. After he died, the place changed hands a dozen times. Nobody ever stayed long. Last owner was a developer who wanted to turn it into a bed and breakfast, but he abandoned the project after 6 months. Said the place had bad bones." Marcus had taken the keys without comment. Bad bones. He had those too. The difference was, he knew exactly what had broken them. Now, sitting in his truck at the end of the road, he studied the fortress with the cold, analytical eye of a man trained to assess defensive positions. The walls were solid, that much was clear. Granite blocks fitted together with the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore, each stone weighing hundreds of pounds. The main gate was a massive wooden door reinforced with iron bands, and though it hung slightly crooked on its hinges, it was still intact. Defensible. Isolated. Exactly what he needed. He put the truck in gear and drove the last 100 yards to the gate. When he killed the engine, the silence that rushed in was absolute. No birds sang. No wind moved through the trees. The fortress sat in its clearing like a monument to some forgotten war, and for the first time since he had seen the listing, Marcus felt something stir in the hollow space where his emotions used to live. It wasn't fear. Fear required caring about outcomes, and he had stopped caring about those 3 years ago. It was more like recognition, the way one ruin might recognize another. He climbed out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel that had once been a proper courtyard. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something ancient and mineral, like the smell of a cave. He walked to the main door and pulled out the ring of old skeleton keys Patricia had given him. The largest one, black with age, slid into the lock with surprising ease. The mechanism resisted for a moment, then gave with a groan that sounded almost like a sigh. The door swung inward, and Marcus stepped into the darkness of Callaway Fortress for the first time. The interior was a study in decay and endurance. The entrance hall was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows 2 stories above. Weak daylight filtered through the broken windows, creating pools of gray illumination that only emphasized the darkness between them. The floor was slate, covered in years of dust and the desiccated remains of leaves that had blown in through the gaps in the walls. To his left, a massive stone staircase spiraled upward into the tower. To his right, an arched doorway led deeper into the main structure. Marcus moved through the space with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to entering hostile territory. He checked each room methodically, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The first floor was a maze of interconnected chambers, some large enough to have been gathering halls, others small and cell-like. In what might have been a library, empty shelves lined the walls, and an enormous fireplace dominated one end, its mantel carved with strange symbols that Marcus didn't recognize and didn't care to interpret. In another room, he found the remnants of furniture, a broken chair, a table with 3 legs, a wardrobe lying on its side with the door torn off. Everywhere he looked, there were signs of abandonment, but also signs of something else. Scratches on the stone floors, deep gouges that looked almost deliberate. Scorch marks on the walls that didn't seem to correspond to any fireplace or torch sconce. In one small chamber, he found a message scratched into the plaster with something sharp. The words were crude but legible. "It knows. It waits." Below that, in different handwriting, someone had written, "Leave while you still can." Marcus read the messages without expression. Graffiti. Vandals or teenagers looking for thrills, spinning stories to scare each other. He had seen worse things written on walls in Kandahar and Helmand province, messages left by men who had actually faced real horrors, not imagined ones. He turned away and continued his inspection. The second floor was in worse condition. Part of the roof had collapsed in the eastern wing, and rain had gotten in, rotting the floorboards and creating a garden of black mold that spread across the ceiling like a stain. He avoided that section, moving instead to the tower. The staircase was solid, each step carved from a single piece of granite. He climbed slowly, testing each tread before putting his full weight on it. The third floor of the tower was a single circular room with 6 narrow windows spaced evenly around the circumference. From here, he could see the entire valley below, a patchwork of forest and the occasional dirt road snaking through the trees. In the distance, perhaps 10 miles away, he could make out the small town of Thornhill, just a cluster of buildings and a church steeple. This room, he decided, would be his. It was defensible, with clear sight lines in all directions. It was isolated enough that he wouldn't have to hear footsteps from other rooms. And most importantly, it felt final, like the last room at the end of a long retreat. He descended the stairs and went back out to his truck. His belongings didn't take long to unload. The duffel bag contained clothes, a sleeping bag, a few basic toiletries, and a small wooden box he never opened. From behind the seat, he pulled out a backpack with a camp stove, some canned food, and a water filtration system. That was it. Everything he owned, everything he had left after he had walked away from the life that no longer fit. He carried it all up to the tower room and set up a temporary camp in the corner farthest from the windows. The sleeping bag went on the floor. The camp stove went near the old fireplace, which, when he inspected it, still had a functional flue. He would need firewood, and soon. The temperature was already dropping, and October in the mountains meant freezing nights. As the sun began to set, Marcus sat on the stone floor of his new home and ate a cold meal from a can. Through the western window, he watched the light drain from the sky, the forest below turning from green to black. The fortress around him creaked and settled, old stones adjusting to the temperature change, wood beams contracting. To someone else, the sounds might have been unsettling. To Marcus, they were just the noises of a structure doing what structures do. There was nothing supernatural about entropy. He finished his meal, cleaned the can, and prepared for sleep. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He had no phone to check, no one to call even if he did. The silence was complete, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something close to relief. Here, in this abandoned place, there were no expectations. No one would ask him how he was doing. No one would look at him with that mixture of pity and fear that he had come to recognize in the eyes of everyone who knew what had happened. No one would try to fix him. He lay down in his sleeping bag and stared up at the dark ceiling. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and filled with the usual dreams. Sand and blood. The sound of an IED detonating. The screams of his squad. The terrible silence that came after. He woke several times, his heart racing, his body slick with sweat despite the cold. Each time, he forced himself to breathe slowly, to remember where he was. Not Afghanistan. Not the field hospital. Not the psychiatric ward at Walter Reed. A fortress. A ruin. A place where the only enemy was himself. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Marcus woke with the sun, a habit so deeply ingrained that not even civilian life had managed to break it. He ate a breakfast of instant oatmeal and instant coffee, both prepared on his camp stove, and then set about the business of survival. He needed firewood, a lot of it, and he needed to make the tower room more livable before the real cold set in. He spent the morning exploring the forest around the fortress, gathering deadfall and dragging it back to the courtyard. The work was hard and mindless, exactly what he needed. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the chill, and his muscles, soft from months of inactivity, began to protest. He ignored the pain. Pain was simple. Pain made sense. By noon, he had a respectable pile of wood stacked against the outer wall. He was splitting logs with a rusty axe he had found in one of the outbuildings when he heard the sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crack of the axe blade biting into wood. A whimper. High and thin and desperate. Marcus stopped mid-swing, the axe frozen above his head. He listened. The sound came again, drifting up from somewhere below the fortress, down the slope where the land dropped away sharply into a ravine choked with brush and fallen trees. It was an animal sound, unmistakably canine. His first instinct was to ignore it. Whatever was down there, it wasn't his problem. He had come here to be alone, to escape the weight of other lives depending on him. He lowered the axe and prepared to go back to work. The whimper came again, weaker this time, fading. And despite everything, despite the walls he had built and the distance he had put between himself and the world, something in that sound pulled at him. It was the sound of a creature in pain, alone and abandoned. It was a sound he recognized in his bones. He set down the axe and walked to the edge of the courtyard. The slope below was steep and treacherous, a tangle of rocks and thorny undergrowth. He could see nothing moving down there, but the whimpering continued, irregular now, punctuated by long silences that were somehow worse than the cries. Marcus swore under his breath. He had no rope, no climbing gear. Going down there was stupid and dangerous. If he broke an ankle or worse, there was no one to help him. He would die on this mountain, and it would be weeks before anyone even noticed he was missing. He stood there for a long moment, caught between the smart decision and the right one. Then, moving with the kind of grim determination that had gotten him through 2 combat deployments, he began to descend. The going was brutal. The slope was loose with shale that skittered out from under his boots. Brambles tore at his hands and face. Twice he lost his footing and slid several feet before catching himself on a tree trunk. But he kept moving, following the sound, which was growing weaker with each passing minute. He found the dog at the bottom of the ravine, wedged between 2 large boulders. It was a German shepherd, or had been once. Now it was a skeletal wreck, its ribs showing through matted fur, its eyes dull with pain and dehydration. One of its hind legs was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. The dog lifted its head when Marcus appeared, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. The animal's eyes were brown and intelligent, and in them, Marcus saw something he hadn't expected. Not fear or aggression, but resignation. This dog had been through something terrible. It had survived as long as it could. And now it was waiting to die. Marcus knelt down slowly, making himself as small and unthreatening as possible. The dog watched him but didn't growl. He reached out a hand, letting the animal smell him. After a moment, the dog's tail moved once, a weak thump against the ground that might have been hope or might have been a final goodbye. Examining the injuries, Marcus could see the dog had been down here for at least a day, maybe longer. The broken leg was bad, but it was the dehydration that would kill it first. He needed to get it back up to the fortress, but the slope was too steep to carry an injured animal, especially one that probably weighed 60 pounds even in its emaciated state. He sat back on his heels and considered his options. He could leave the dog here. It would be the practical choice, the smart choice. Nature would take its course. Or he could do what every instinct in his body was telling him was foolish. He could save it. The decision, when it came, wasn't really a decision at all. He had seen too much death. He had failed too many people. He couldn't walk away from this. Marcus took off his flannel shirt, leaving himself in just a t-shirt against the cold. Working carefully, he fashioned a makeshift sling, wrapping it around the dog's body and under its front legs. The animal whined when he lifted it, but it didn't try to bite. It seemed to understand that he was trying to help. The climb back up was one of the hardest things Marcus had ever done. The dog was heavier than it looked, dead weight in his arms. His muscles screamed. His lungs burned. The loose shale kept sliding under his boots, threatening to send them both tumbling back down. But he kept climbing, one foot in front of the other, refusing to think about how far he had to go or how badly this could end. When he finally pulled himself over the lip of the courtyard, he lay there for a long moment, gasping for air, the dog still cradled against his chest. The sun was lower in the sky now, the shadows growing long. He had wasted hours on this rescue, hours he should have spent preparing for winter. But as he felt the dog's heart beating against his arm, fast and frightened but alive, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. He carried the animal up to the tower room and laid it gently on an old tarp he spread out near the fireplace. The dog's eyes followed him as he moved around the room, gathering supplies. He had a basic first aid kit in his backpack, military issue, designed for human injuries but adaptable. He also had water, which was more important right now than anything else. He poured water into his spare metal bowl and held it to the dog's muzzle. At first, the animal just stared at it, as if it had forgotten what water was. Then, with a desperate eagerness that was painful to watch, it began to lap at the bowl, drinking so fast Marcus had to pull it away to keep it from making itself sick. After a few minutes, he let the dog drink again, more slowly this time. Then he turned his attention to the broken leg. He had set bones before, in field conditions with supplies far more primitive than what he had now. But those had been human bones, and the patients had been conscious enough to understand that the pain was necessary. This dog would only know that he was hurting it. Marcus took a deep breath and began to work. He fashioned a splint from 2 straight pieces of wood and strips torn from an old shirt. The dog yelped and tried to pull away when he straightened the leg, but it was too weak to put up much of a fight. He worked quickly and efficiently, binding the splint tight enough to immobilize the break but not so tight that it would cut off circulation. When he was finished, the dog lay panting, its eyes glazed with pain but also with something that might have been trust. He gave it more water and opened a can of beef stew, dumping half of it into the bowl. The dog ate with the same desperate hunger with which it had drunk, and Marcus had to fight the urge to give it more. Too much food too fast would be as dangerous as none at all. When the dog had finished eating, it lay its head down on the tarp and closed its eyes. Within moments, it was asleep, its breathing evening out into the steady rhythm of deep exhaustion. Marcus sat back against the stone wall and watched it. He tried to remember the last time he had been responsible for another living thing. Not since before. Not since his squad. Not since he had led them into that village and 3 of them hadn't come back out. The weight of that memory pressed down on him, familiar and crushing. He closed his eyes and let it wash over him. He had learned that fighting it only made it worse. Better to let it come, to remember their faces and their voices and the way they had looked at him with trust and confidence that he hadn't deserved. Better to remember how he had failed them. When he opened his eyes again, the dog was watching him. Its brown eyes were clearer now, more alert. It thumped its tail once against the tarp, a soft sound in the quiet room. Marcus found himself speaking, his voice rough from disuse. "You're a tough one, aren't you? Surviving out here all alone." The dog's tail thumped again. "Yeah," he said. "I know something about that." As the sun set and the tower room filled with shadows, Marcus built a fire in the old fireplace. The wood was dry and caught easily, filling the space with warmth and flickering light. He made himself another can of stew and ate it slowly, sitting with his back against the wall. The dog slept on, occasionally twitching or making small sounds in its dreams. For the first time since he had arrived at the fortress, Marcus didn't feel entirely alone. The presence of another heartbeat in the room, another creature that had survived against the odds, changed something in the atmosphere. The stone walls felt less like a tomb and more like a shelter. The silence felt less like emptiness and more like peace. That night, when the dreams came, they were different. He still saw the explosion. He still heard the screams. But when he woke, gasping and shaking in the darkness, there was a warm weight pressed against his side. The dog had dragged itself across the floor and was lying next to him, its head resting on his leg. Its eyes were open, watching him with an expression that was impossibly human in its understanding. Marcus reached down and rested his hand on the dog's head. The fur was matted and dirty, but it was warm and real and alive. He could feel the dog's heartbeat under his palm, steady and strong. Neither of them moved for a long time. They lay there in the darkness of the tower room, two broken creatures finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. And for the first time in 3 years, Marcus Webb felt something other than pain. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't hope. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had planned but both seemed to need. Marcus would wake at dawn, stoke the fire, and prepare a simple breakfast that he now shared with the dog. He had started calling it Sergeant, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe because of the way the dog watched everything with sharp, assessing eyes. Maybe because it had survived something that should have killed it. Or maybe because giving it a name made the tower room feel less like a place where he was waiting to fade away and more like a place where something new might begin. Sergeant's recovery was remarkable. Within 3 days, the dog was able to stand, putting careful weight on the splinted leg. Within a week, it was hobbling around the tower room, investigating every corner with the thorough attention of a trained animal. Marcus watched and recognized military bearing when he saw it. This wasn't some stray that had wandered into the mountains. This was a working dog, probably police or military, and that meant someone had lost it. Or abandoned it. The thought made something hot and ugly stir in Marcus's chest. He knew what it felt like to be used and then discarded. He knew what it felt like to be told you were no longer needed, that your service was appreciated but your presence was inconvenient. The dog had probably been retired, deemed too old or too injured to work, and someone had decided that a bullet or a long drive to nowhere was easier than finding it a home. He ran his hand over Sergeant's head, feeling the bumps and scars hidden beneath the fur. "Yeah," he said quietly. "They don't know what to do with us when we're broken, do they?" The dog looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes and licked his hand once. As Sergeant grew stronger, Marcus began taking it outside for short walks around the fortress grounds. The dog moved with a limp that would probably never fully heal, but it didn't seem to mind. It would range ahead, nose to the ground, investigating every smell and sound with the focused intensity of an animal born to work. When it found something interesting, it would stop and look back at Marcus, waiting for him to catch up, a behavior so ingrained it was clearly the result of years of training. During one of these walks, about 10 days after the rescue, Sergeant led Marcus to a part of the fortress he hadn't fully explored yet. It was the collapsed eastern wing, the section he had avoided because of the rotted floors and dangerous structure. But the dog kept pulling toward it, whining and looking back at him with an insistence that was impossible to ignore. Marcus followed reluctantly, testing each step carefully. The corridor was dark and smelled of mold and decay. Water dripped somewhere in the shadows, a steady rhythm that echoed off the stone walls. Sargent moved ahead with surprising confidence, navigating around holes in the floor and ducking under a beam that had fallen at an angle. They emerged into what had once been a large chamber, perhaps a dining hall or meeting room. The roof here had partially collapsed, letting in shafts of gray daylight that illuminated the destruction below. Furniture lay in splinters. The walls were blackened with old fire damage. And in the center of the room, barely visible beneath years of debris and fallen stones, was a trapdoor. Sargent went straight to it, pawing at the wood and whining. Marcus approached cautiously. The trapdoor was made of heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands. A rusted chain and padlock secured it, but the wood around the lock was rotted. When Marcus pulled on the chain, it came away in his hands, the screws pulling free from the decayed wood as easily as pulling teeth from a corpse. He stared down at the trapdoor for a long moment. Every instinct told him to leave it alone, to walk away, to forget he had seen it. But Sargent was scratching at the wood now, whining with an urgency that bordered on desperation. The dog knew something was down there. And despite his better judgment, Marcus needed to know what. He bent down and grasped the iron ring set into the trapdoor. The wood resisted for a moment, swollen with moisture and age, then gave with a groan that sounded far too much like a warning. The door swung open, revealing a set of stone steps descending into absolute darkness. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying with it a smell that made Marcus's stomach clench. It was the smell of earth and stone and something else, something old and wrong that he couldn't quite identify. Sargent stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into the darkness, every muscle in its body tense. Marcus went back to the tower room and retrieved his flashlight, a heavy-duty military model that could punch a beam through the thickest darkness. When he returned, Sargent was still waiting by the trapdoor, though the dog had stopped whining. Now it just watched the stairs with an intensity that raised the hair on the back of Marcus's neck. He clicked on the flashlight and started down. The stairs were steep and narrow, carved directly into the bedrock of the mountain. They descended for what felt like forever, turning in a tight spiral that made Marcus's head spin. The beam of his flashlight showed smooth stone walls streaked with moisture and something that might have been rust or might have been something else. He counted the steps as he went, a habit from his military days. 20. 30. 40. At 50, the stairs ended. He found himself in a chamber unlike anything he had seen in the fortress above. This room was perfectly circular, about 30 feet across, with a domed ceiling that rose to a point directly above the center. The walls were lined with niches, each one containing objects that gleamed dully in his flashlight beam. But it was the floor that stopped him cold. It was covered in symbols. Intricate, interlocking patterns carved directly into the stone and filled with what looked like lead or pewter. They formed a massive circle that took up most of the floor space, and within that circle were more symbols, geometric shapes and characters that might have been letters from some alphabet Marcus didn't recognize. At the very center of the circle was a raised platform, and on that platform was a wooden chest. Sargent had followed him down the stairs and now stood beside him, pressing against his leg. The dog was shaking, whether from cold or fear Marcus couldn't tell. He moved forward slowly, careful not to step on any of the symbols. Something about desecrating them felt deeply wrong, though he couldn't have said why. As he got closer, he could see that the chest was old, very old, made of dark wood bound with iron that had oxidized to a deep red-brown. There was no lock, just a simple latch. His hand hesitated over it. This felt like a threshold, like opening this chest would change something fundamental. But he had come this far. He had to know. The latch lifted with surprising ease. The hinges, ancient as they were, moved without a sound. Marcus opened the chest and shone his light inside. For a long moment, he couldn't process what he was seeing. Then, All at once, it came into focus, and the breath left his body in a rush. The chest was filled with letters. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all addressed in the same careful handwriting. But it wasn't the letters themselves that made Marcus's hands start to shake. It was what was underneath them. Dog tags. Dozens of pairs, on worn chains, each one stamped with a name and a service number. And beneath those, medals. Purple hearts. Bronze stars. Silver stars. Some so old they were from wars Marcus had only read about in history books. World War I. World War II. Korea. Vietnam. The Gulf. Afghanistan. Iraq. These weren't just any medals. These were the medals of the dead and the forgotten, the ones who had come back broken and been discarded. And the letters, Marcus pulled one out with trembling hands, were all the same. Letters from the Veterans Administration. Letters from military hospitals. Letters denying care, denying benefits, denying the very existence of the wounds these men carried. He sank to his knees beside the chest, the flashlight beam wavering as his hands shook. Sergeant pressed against him, whining softly. Marcus barely noticed. He was reading the letters now, one after another, and each one was a knife to the heart. We regret to inform you that your claim for service-connected disability has been denied. Your symptoms do not meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. We have determined that your injuries were not sustained in the line of duty. On and on they went, a chorus of bureaucratic cruelty, each one a door slammed in the face of someone who had given everything and been told it wasn't enough. And the names on the dog tags, Marcus cross-referenced them with the letters, matched the names of men who had lived in this area, men who had come home broken and been turned away by the very country they had served. At the bottom of the chest, beneath all the letters and medals, was a journal. The leather cover was cracked with age, and when Marcus opened it, the pages crackled. The handwriting was the same as on the letters' addresses, precise and controlled. He began to read, and the story that unfolded was one of rage and grief and a kind of justice that existed outside any law. The journal belonged to Josiah Calloway, the man who had built this fortress. But Calloway hadn't been a coal baron or a timber magnate. That had been a cover story, a lie to explain his wealth and his isolation. The truth was far stranger and far sadder. Josiah Calloway had been a field surgeon in the Civil War, attached to the Union Army. He had seen things in those field hospitals that had broken something fundamental in his mind. He had watched boys die from wounds that should have been treatable, watched them beg for help that never came, watched them be abandoned by a government that had spent their lives like currency and then refused to pay the debt. After the war, Calloway had dedicated his life to helping veterans. He had used his family's money to build this fortress, not as a home, but as a sanctuary. A place where men who had been broken by war could come and find shelter, find healing, find someone who understood. For decades, he had run it in secret, taking in the unwanted and the forgotten, the ones who woke screaming in the night and couldn't hold down jobs and frighten their own families. But it hadn't been enough. It could never be enough. The tide of broken men was endless, and Calloway's resources were finite. The journal entries grew darker and more desperate as the years passed. He wrote about men who had killed themselves in his care, unable to bear the weight of their memories. He wrote about men who had simply wandered off into the mountains one day and never returned. He wrote about his own growing madness, the way the screams of the dying had started to echo in his head even when he was alone. The final entry was dated 1924. It was short and written in a hand that had lost all of its earlier precision. I can no longer tell the difference between the ghosts I tend and the ghosts in my mind. They are all the same now, all crying out for help that will never come. I have collected their stories, their honors, their proof that they existed and that they mattered. When I am gone, perhaps someone will find this place. Perhaps someone will understand that these men were not broken. They were betrayed. Below that, in different ink in a shakier hand, was one last line. I hear them in the walls. They want me to remember. I will never forget. Marcus sat in the darkness of that underground chamber, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten soldiers, and for the first time since he had come home from his last deployment, he allowed himself to cry. Not the silent tears he had shed alone in hospital rooms and halfway houses, but great racking sobs that tore from his chest and echoed off the stone walls. Sargent pressed against him, a warm solid presence in the darkness, and Marcus buried his face in the dog's fur and wept for every man whose name was on those dog tags, for every letter that had been a rejection and a betrayal, and for himself. He wept until he had nothing left, until his throat was raw and his eyes were swollen. And when the tears finally stopped, he sat in the silence and felt something shift inside him. The weight he had been carrying, the crushing guilt and shame and rage, was still there. It would probably always be there. But it felt different now, distributed somehow, as if he had been joined by an army of ghosts who understood exactly what he carried because they had carried it too. He looked down at Sargent, who was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes. The dog's tail moved once, a soft thump against the stone floor. "They left us behind," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. "All of us. But we're still here. We survived." He stood up slowly, his legs stiff from kneeling. He looked around the chamber one last time, at the niches in the walls and the symbols on the floor and the chest full of memories that no one had wanted to keep. Then he made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He wasn't going to hide anymore. He wasn't going to let this place be forgotten, and he wasn't going to let these men be forgotten. Josiah Calloway had tried to help and had been defeated by the enormity of the task. But maybe Marcus could do what Calloway couldn't. Maybe he could tell their stories. Maybe he could make people remember. He gathered up the journal, a handful of the letters, and one set of dog tags. The name stamped into the metal was Robert Chen, PFC, United States Army. The tags were from Vietnam, and the letter attached to them was a denial of benefits dated 1973. Marcus slipped the chain over his neck, feeling the weight of the tag settle against his chest next to his own. Then he picked up the flashlight and headed for the stairs, Sargent limping along beside him. Behind them, the chest sat open in the darkness, a wound that had finally been allowed to bleed. When they emerged into the ruined dining hall, the daylight seemed impossibly bright. Marcus pulled the trapdoor shut and stood there for a moment, looking down at the scarred wood. This wasn't over. The story wasn't finished. But for the first time since he had bought this cursed, haunted fortress for $300, Marcus Webb felt like he had a purpose that went beyond simple survival. He had found something in the darkness beneath the stones. He had found his mission. Over the following weeks, the fortress began to transform in ways both subtle and profound. Marcus threw himself into the work of restoration with an energy he hadn't felt in years. But he wasn't trying to erase what the place had been. He was trying to honor it, to make it functional again so that it could serve the purpose for which Calloway had built it, even if that purpose had evolved with time. He started with the tower room, making it not just livable but comfortable. He hauled materials up the mountain in his truck, trips that took hours on the rutted roads. Insulation for the walls. A wood stove to replace the inadequate fireplace. Proper bedding. A table and chairs. He worked from dawn until dark, and Sargent was always there, watching from a corner or limping around the room to inspect his progress with those assessing brown eyes. The dog's presence had become essential in a way Marcus couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just companionship, though that was part of it. It was accountability. Having another living creature depend on him meant he couldn't simply give up. He had to get out of bed. He had to prepare food. He had to maintain the fire. These small responsibilities created a structure that his days had lacked, a framework that kept the darkness at bay. As Sargent grew stronger and the limp became less pronounced, the dog's true nature began to reveal itself more fully. This wasn't just a trained animal. This was a highly specialized working dog, and its instincts ran deep. It would patrol the perimeter of the fortress every morning and evening, following the same route with military precision. It would alert to any unusual sound, its body going still and focused in a way that told Marcus this dog had once been responsible for keeping people alive. One afternoon, Marcus was working on clearing debris from one of the ground floor rooms when Sargent suddenly appeared in the doorway, every muscle tense. The dog gave a single sharp bark, the kind that demanded immediate attention, then turned and headed for the main entrance. Marcus dropped what he was doing and followed. Outside, a vehicle was making its way up the mountain road. Marcus's hand instinctively moved to his hip, reaching for a weapon that hadn't been there in 3 years. He forced himself to relax, to breathe. Sergeant stood beside him, alert but not aggressive, waiting for his command. The vehicle that emerged from the trees was a sheriff's department SUV, and Marcus felt his stomach clench. He had avoided all contact with local law enforcement, had gone out of his way to stay off their radar. Whatever this was, it couldn't be good. The SUV pulled into the courtyard and stopped. The door opened, and a woman in her early 40s stepped out. She was tall and solidly built, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that took in everything with practiced efficiency. Her uniform was crisp, her movements confident. She was someone who was used to being in control. She stopped a respectful distance away, her gaze moving from Marcus to Sergeant and back again. Her expression was unreadable. "Mr. Webb?" Her voice was professionally neutral. "I'm Deputy Sheriff Karen Reyes. Mind if I have a word?" Marcus said nothing, just waited. Years of dealing with military bureaucracy had taught him that silence was often the best strategy. Let them talk first. Let them show their hand. Reyes seemed to understand this. She nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a fellow professional. "I've been hearing stories about you. About how you rescued a hiker a few weeks back, kept him alive until the rescue team could get there. Chief Miller speaks highly of you." Marcus remained silent. Sergeant sat down beside him, still watchful. The deputy glanced at the dog, and something in her expression shifted. "That's an interesting animal you've got there. Looks like a working dog. Military or police, I'd guess. You happen to know where it came from?" "Found it," Marcus said, his voice rough from lack of use. "Injured in a ravine. Fixed it up." Reyes nodded slowly. "The thing is, we've been getting reports. Hikers, hunters, people who pass by this area. They say they've been hearing things. Voices in the night. Screaming. Some folks are saying this place is haunted, that old Calloway's ghost is still wandering around up here." Marcus almost laughed. Almost. The idea that after everything he had found in the chamber below, after all the real ghosts he carried, people were worried about supernatural ones was absurd. But he kept his face neutral. "Old buildings make noise. Whine through broken windows sounds like a lot of things." "I'm sure it does," Reyes agreed. "But the reports have been consistent enough that I needed to check it out. Make sure everything's all right up here." She paused, studying him. "Make sure you're all right." There it was. The real reason for the visit. Marcus had seen it before, the way people looked at veterans, especially ones who isolated themselves. They were always watching for signs of a breakdown, always ready to intervene before someone did something newsworthy. The concern was genuine, he didn't doubt that, but it was also exhausting. "I'm fine," he said flatly. "Just want to be left alone." Reyes held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Fair enough. But I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Webb. This county is my responsibility. The people in it are my responsibility. That includes you. If you need anything, if things get to be too much, my number's on this card." She pulled out a business card and held it out. Marcus made no move to take it. After a moment, she walked forward slowly, placed it on a nearby stone wall, and stepped back. Sergeant watched her the entire time but made no sound. "Also," Reyes continued, "I made some calls after Chief Miller told me about you. Called some contacts I have in veteran services. There are programs, support groups, counseling. People who understand what you've been through." "I don't need counseling," Marcus said, the words coming out harder than he intended. "Maybe not," Reyes said evenly. "But the offer stands. And there's something else." She gestured toward Sergeant. "That dog. I ran its description through some databases. There's a K-9 unit about 2 counties over that reported a dog missing about 3 months ago. German Shepherd, male, approximately 6 years old. Retired from service due to an injury. The handler was supposed to adopt him, but the dog got loose during transport and disappeared. Marcus felt his chest tighten. He looked down at Sargent, who was watching the deputy with calm attention. 3 months. The dog had been out there for 3 months before he found it. The handler's name is James Cooper, Reyes continued. He's been looking for that dog ever since. Blames himself for losing it. I can give you his contact information if you want to reach out, see if this might be the same animal. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and set it next to the business card. Then she stepped back, giving Marcus space. I'm not here to take your dog, Mr. Webb. I'm not here to cause problems. I just thought you should know. And I thought maybe, if this is the right dog, its handler might like to know it's alive and being cared for. With that, she nodded once, got back in her SUV, and drove away, leaving Marcus standing in the courtyard with Sargent at his side and 2 pieces of paper on the wall that felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds each. That night, Marcus sat in the tower room with the paper unfolded in front of him. It contained a name, James Cooper, a phone number, and an address in a town called Riverside, about 80 miles south. There was also a note in Reyes's handwriting, former Marine. 2 tours. Good man. Marcus stared at the information for a long time. Sargent lay on his bed, the custom platform Marcus had built, watching him with those knowing eyes. The right thing to do was obvious. Call the number. Reunite the dog with its handler. Give back what had been lost. But the thought of doing that, of losing the one living thing that had pulled him back from the edge, made something in Marcus's chest constrict so tightly he could barely breathe. Sargent wasn't just a dog. He was a lifeline. He was the reason Marcus got up in the morning. He was proof that broken things could heal, that loyalty existed even in a world that had forgotten what the word meant. How could he give that up? He looked at Sargent, and the dog looked back. In that moment, Marcus saw something in those brown eyes that he hadn't allowed himself to see before. He saw loss. He saw a dog that had been trained to work with a specific person, that had bonded with that person, that had been separated through no fault of its own and had spent 3 months lost and alone, waiting for someone who never came. James Cooper was still looking. Still blaming himself. Still hoping. Marcus knew exactly what that felt like. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He couldn't make this decision tonight. Maybe not tomorrow either. But he knew, deep in the part of himself that was still a Marine, still bound by codes of honor that civilian life hadn't managed to erase, that he would have to make it eventually. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with clouds hanging low over the mountains and a fine mist that wasn't quite rain but soaked everything it touched. Marcus stood at the window of the tower room, drinking coffee and watching the valley disappear into the fog. Sargent came to stand beside him, and Marcus rested his hand on the dog's head. You miss him, don't you? He said quietly. Your handler. Cooper. Sargent leaned into his leg, and Marcus took that as confirmation. The dog was loyal to him now, had bonded with him through the process of healing, but that didn't erase what had come before. Didn't erase the training, the years of working together, the connection between handler and dog that was as close as any human relationship could be. Marcus had lost his squad. He knew what it was like to lose the people you worked with, the people who depended on you and on whom you depended. He knew the guilt that came with survival when others hadn't made it. And he knew that James Cooper was probably living with a version of that same guilt, blaming himself for losing a dog he was responsible for, wondering if it was suffering or dead. He couldn't do that to another veteran. He couldn't be the reason Cooper spent the rest of his life wandering. The decision made, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He would call. He would arrange a meeting. And if Sargent chose to go back to Cooper, Marcus would let him go. It would hurt. God, it would hurt. But it would be the right thing to do, and after 3 years of hiding from the world and from himself, maybe it was time to start doing right things again. He pulled out the paper and looked at the phone number. He had a cell phone, though he rarely turned it on. The signal up here was spotty at best, but if he drove down the mountain a few miles, he could usually get a bar or two. He pocketed the paper, pulled on his jacket, and headed for the door. Sergeant, as always, followed. The drive down the mountain was slow, the mist making visibility poor. Marcus kept his eyes on the narrow road, navigating by memory as much as by sight. When he reached a small clearing where he knew the signal was usually decent, he pulled over and killed the engine. He sat there for a long moment, the phone in his hand, the number on the screen. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he pressed dial. The phone rang 3 times before someone picked up. Hello? The voice was male, weary, the voice of someone who had learned not to trust unexpected calls. Is this James Cooper? Marcus asked. Yeah. Who's this? My name is Marcus Webb. I'm calling about a dog. A German Shepherd. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, then silence. When Cooper spoke again, his voice was tight with emotion. You found Sergeant? So that was the dog's name. Not the name Marcus had given him, but the name he had always had. It felt right, somehow. Made the connection between them feel less like coincidence and more like fate. I think so, Marcus said. Found him about a month ago, injured in a ravine near my property. Fixed him up. He's healing well. Where are you? Cooper's voice was urgent now. I'll come get him. Today. Right now. Just tell me where. Marcus gave him the address of the fortress and directions for navigating the mountain roads. Cooper said he'd be there by early afternoon, and Marcus could hear the relief and joy in his voice, the sound of a man who had been given back something he thought was lost forever. After they hung up, Marcus sat in the truck for a long time, staring at the phone. Sergeant sat in the passenger seat, watching him. In a few hours, this dog would be gone. The tower room would be empty again. The fortress would go back to being what it had been before, a place of isolation and ghosts. But it wouldn't, Marcus realized. It couldn't. Because he had found the chamber. He had read Calloway's journal. He had seen the dog tags and the medals and the letters of denial. He had been given a mission, whether he wanted it or not. And that mission didn't end just because Sergeant was leaving. He reached over and scratched the dog behind the ears. You're going home, buddy. Back where you belong. Sergeant licked his hand once, then settled back in the seat, content. The drive back up to the fortress was quiet. Marcus spent the hours before Cooper's arrival preparing. He bathed Sergeant, working carefully around the still healing leg, getting the mats out of his fur until the coat shone. He made sure the dog ate well. He even fashioned a makeshift collar from a piece of leather he found in one of the outbuildings, something dignified for the reunion. When he heard the vehicle coming up the mountain road just after 1 in the afternoon, Marcus was sitting on the stone steps outside the main entrance, Sergeant beside him. The dog's ears perked up, and his body went tense in a way Marcus hadn't seen before. This wasn't the alertness of a threat response. This was recognition. The truck that pulled into the courtyard was a battered Chevy, older even than Marcus's Ford. The man who got out was in his mid-30s, stocky and muscular, with close-cropped hair and a face that had seen too much sun and stress. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, and when he saw Sergeant, he stopped dead in his tracks. For a long moment, neither the man nor the dog moved. They simply stared at each other across the courtyard. Then Cooper dropped to one knee and opened his arms. Sergeant, he said, his voice breaking. Come here, boy. The dog launched himself forward, his limp forgotten in the urgency of the moment. He hit Cooper hard enough to knock the man backward, and then they were a tangle of fur and arms and the kind of joy that made Marcus's chest ache. Cooper was crying openly, his face buried in Sergeant's neck, and the dog was whining and licking his face and wagging his tail so hard his entire body shook. Marcus stood and walked over slowly, giving them space. When Cooper finally looked up, his face was wet with tears, but he was smiling wider than Marcus thought a human face could smile. "I thought he was dead," Cooper said, his voice thick. "I thought I'd killed him. It was my fault. I didn't secure the crate properly, and when we hit a bump, it opened. He jumped out before I could stop him, ran into the woods, and I couldn't find him. I looked for weeks. I thought." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Marcus understood. "He's tough," Marcus said. "Survivor." Cooper stood up, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "How bad was he hurt?" "Broken leg. Dehydration. Starvation." Marcus kept his voice clinical, professional. "Splinted the leg. Fed him. Gave him water. He healed up pretty well." Cooper looked at him for the first time, really looked at him, and Marcus saw recognition in his eyes. The way one veteran recognizes another. "You served," Cooper said. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded. "Marines. Combat engineer." "Marines." Cooper smiled slightly. "I was Army. K-9 handler. 2 tours in Afghanistan." He looked down at Sergeant. "This guy saved my life more times than I can count. Detected IEDs, protected the convoy, pulled me out of a firefight when I got pinned down. When he got hurt and they retired him, I couldn't let him go to anyone else. He was my responsibility." The words hit Marcus like a punch. Responsibility. That was the word Cooper used, not burden, not obligation. Responsibility. The kind of responsibility that meant you didn't give up, didn't let go, didn't stop looking even when every rational voice told you it was hopeless. "He did good here too," Marcus said quietly. "Helped me when I needed it. Found something I wouldn't have found on my own." Cooper looked at him curiously but didn't push. Instead, he reached out his hand. "Thank you. For taking care of him. For calling me. I know it couldn't have been easy." Marcus shook his hand. The grip was firm, the hand calloused. "Working hands. Hands that knew labor. You're taking him home?" "Yeah." Cooper looked down at Sergeant, who was pressed against his leg. "If that's okay with you. I mean, if you want to keep him, if he's happier here." "He'll be happier with you," Marcus said, and he meant it. Even though it hurt. Even though watching them together made the emptiness inside him yawn wider. This is where he belongs. Cooper nodded, then hesitated. "Listen, I don't know what your situation is, and you don't have to tell me. But if you ever need anything, if you ever want to talk, here's my number." He pulled out a card, handwritten, with his name and phone number. "We're all fighting the same war, you know? The one that doesn't end when you come home." Marcus took the card and pocketed it next to Reyes's card. Maybe he would call. Maybe he wouldn't. But having the option felt like something. Cooper opened the door of his truck, and Sergeant jumped in without hesitation, settling into what was clearly his spot. Cooper climbed into the driver's seat, then paused. "What you did, finding him, fixing him up, calling me, that took character. A lot of guys wouldn't have done that." Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say. As the truck pulled away, Sergeant looked back through the rear window, his eyes locked on Marcus. The dog didn't whine or bark. He just watched, and Marcus watched back, until the truck disappeared around a bend in the road and the fortress was silent again. Marcus stood in the empty courtyard for a long time after they were gone. The mist had lifted slightly, and he could see down into the valley where the lights of Thornhill were beginning to flicker on in the gathering dusk. The fortress felt emptier than it ever had before. The tower room, when he climbed back up to it, seemed vast and cold despite the fire still burning in the stove. He sat on his bed and looked at the empty platform where Sergeant had slept. The loss was physical, a weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe. He had done the right thing. He knew that. But knowing something was right didn't make it hurt any less. As the darkness deepened outside and the old building creaked and settled around him, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the dog tags he had taken from the underground chamber. Robert Chen. PFC. He ran his thumb over the raised letters and thought about Josiah Calloway, about the decades he had spent trying to help broken men, about how he had ultimately been defeated not by lack of will but by the sheer enormity of the need. One man couldn't save everyone. Couldn't fix every injustice. But maybe one man could tell the stories. Could make sure they weren't forgotten. Could shine a light into the darkness and say, these people mattered. Marcus stood and walked to the window. Below him, the fortress sprawled in the moonlight, ancient and damaged but still standing. Still strong. Like him. Like Sargent. Like all the men whose medals and letters lay in the chamber below. He had given Sargent back to Cooper because it was the right thing to do. Because holding on to something that didn't belong to you, no matter how much you needed it, was a kind of theft. But in doing so, he had proven something to himself. He was still capable of making the hard choice. Still capable of putting someone else's needs above his own. Still capable of being the man he thought he had lost in the dust and blood of a foreign war. The fortress wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by memory, by the accumulated weight of all the men who had suffered here and been forgotten. But memory could be honored. Stories could be told. And maybe, just maybe, Marcus Webb could be the one to tell them. He looked down at the dog tags in his hand one more time, then slipped the chain back over his neck. Tomorrow, he would begin. He would document what he had found. He would research the names on those tags. He would track down their stories, their families, their final days. He would build something here, not a sanctuary this time, but a memorial. A place where people could come and remember. It wouldn't bring them back. Nothing would. But it would ensure they weren't lost. And in a world that seemed determined to forget the cost of its wars, that was something worth fighting for. The night deepened, and Marcus sat alone in his tower room, planning his next mission. The fortress was silent around him, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full of purpose. Full of possibility. Full of the kind of hope that comes not from easy answers but from hard work and the refusal to give up. He had lost Sargent, but he had found something more important. He had found a reason to keep going. And for a man who had spent 3 years trying to figure out how to survive, that was everything. Winter came to Black Ridge Mountain with the inevitability of an advancing army. The first snow fell in mid-November, dusting the fortress in white and making the stone walls look even more ancient, more eternal. Marcus had spent the weeks since Sargent's departure working with a focus that bordered on obsession. The underground chamber had become his study, his archive, his sacred trust. He had hauled down a table, a battery-powered lamp, notebooks, and a laptop he charged using a small solar panel array he had installed on the tower roof. The fortress still had no electricity, no running water beyond what he hauled up from the stream, no connection to the modern world. But Marcus had learned to live with less in forward operating bases in Afghanistan. Comfort was negotiable. Purpose was not. Every morning, he would descend those 50 stone steps into the circular chamber and open the chest that held the remnants of forgotten lives. He worked systematically, creating a catalog of every item. Each set of dog tags got its own page in his notebook. Name, rank, service number, dates of service. Each medal was photographed and documented. Each letter was read, transcribed, and filed. It was painstaking work, the kind that made his eyes ache and his back protest, but it was also the most important thing he had ever done. The stories that emerged from those documents were heartbreaking in their consistency. Robert Chen, the soldier whose tags Marcus wore around his neck, had returned from Vietnam in 1971. He had filed for disability benefits related to hearing loss from artillery fire and psychological trauma from witnessing atrocities. His claim had been denied 3 times over the course of 2 years. The final letter, dated 1973, informed him that his symptoms were not service-connected and that no further appeals would be considered. According to a newspaper clipping Marcus had found tucked into the same envelope, Robert Chen had died in 1974 at the age of 24. The cause of death was listed as accidental overdose. Thomas Whitmore, a World War II veteran, had lost both legs to a landmine in France. He had come home to find that his disability payments were insufficient to cover his medical expenses. His letters to the Veterans Administration were polite at first, then desperate, then angry. The last one, written in a shaking hand, simply said he could not continue living as a burden to his family. He had died in 1953. The obituary mentioned survived by a wife and 3 children, but made no mention of his service or his sacrifice. William Hayes. Korean War. Filed for treatment of frostbite injuries that had cost him 3 toes and permanent nerve damage in his hands. Denied. Died homeless in 1968. Samuel Brooks. Gulf War. Filed for treatment of mysterious respiratory problems that multiple doctors confirmed were consistent with exposure to chemical agents. Denied. Died in 2004 at the age of 46, his lungs destroyed. On and on the stories went, each one a small tragedy, each one a betrayal by the country these men had served. Marcus read every letter, traced every life as far as the documentation would allow, and felt the weight of their abandonment settle onto his own shoulders. He understood now why Calloway had built this place. He understood the desperate need to do something, anything, to acknowledge that these lives had mattered. But understanding and solving were different things. What could Marcus do with this information? He was one man in a crumbling fortress on a mountain that most people avoided. He had no platform, no influence, no resources beyond the $300 he had spent to buy this place and the modest disability check that came once a month. He could document the stories, but who would read them? He could preserve the memory, but who would remember? The question haunted him through December as the snow deepened and the isolation became nearly absolute. The road up the mountain was impassable now. He had stocked enough supplies to last until spring, but that also meant no contact with the outside world. Just Marcus and his ghosts and the work that consumed his days. On Christmas Eve, he sat in the underground chamber with a bottle of whiskey he had been saving and spread out the dog tags on the table before him. 63 sets. 63 men who had died forgotten. He touched each one, reading the names aloud, or roll call for the absent. When he finished, he raised his glass in a silent toast and drank. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn, a clean pain that had nothing to do with memory or loss. He was halfway through his second glass when he heard it. A sound from above, from the fortress proper. A footstep on stone, slow and deliberate. Marcus froze, his hand moving instinctively to his belt where a knife hung in a leather sheath. He had heard the stories the locals told about this place being haunted, but he had dismissed them as superstition. Now, alone in the depths with nothing but the dead for company, those stories felt less like folklore and more like warning. The footstep came again, closer now. Then another. Someone was in the fortress. Someone was descending the stairs to the chamber. Marcus stood and moved to the side of the entrance, his back against the wall, the knife in his hand. The lamp cast his shadow long and distorted across the floor. He controlled his breathing, slowed his heart rate, became the soldier he had been trained to be. Whoever was coming down those stairs was about to have a very unpleasant surprise. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness beyond. Marcus raised the knife. Then the figure spoke. "Easy, Marine. I come in peace." Marcus knew that voice. Deputy Sheriff Karen Reyes stepped into the light, her hands raised to show they were empty. She was dressed in civilian clothes now, heavy winter gear, her face red from the cold. She looked at the knife in his hand without apparent concern. "You always greet visitors like that?" she asked. "You always break into people's homes?" Marcus countered, but he lowered the knife. "Door was unlocked. I knocked. You didn't answer." She looked around the chamber, taking in the table covered with documents, the open chest, the dog tags spread out like an accusation. "I got worried when I saw smoke from your chimney but no response. Thought maybe something had happened." Marcus slid the knife back into its sheath. "How did you get up here?" "Roads closed. Snowmobile. Parked it outside." She walked slowly into the chamber, her eyes moving from the symbols on the floor to the niches in the walls. "This is incredible. How did you find this?" "My dog found it." Marcus paused. "The dog I gave back." Reyes nodded. "Cooper told me. Said you did right by him and by the animal. That takes character." She moved to the table and looked down at the dog tags. "What is all this?" Marcus hesitated. He had spent weeks alone with these stories, these ghosts. Sharing them felt like a violation, like exposing something sacred to profane eyes. But Reyes was still looking at the tags with an expression that was neither curious nor judgmental. She was simply waiting, giving him space to decide. "Sit down," he said finally. "This is going to take a while." He told her everything. About Calloway, about the journal, about the men whose stories lay buried in this chamber. He showed her the letters of denial, the medals that meant nothing without the recognition they deserved, the pattern of abandonment that stretched across decades and wars. Reyes listened without interrupting, and as Marcus talked, he realized he had been starving for this. For someone to hear. For someone to understand. When he finished, Reyes sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You know what you have here, right? This isn't just a collection of sad stories. This is evidence. Evidence of systemic failure, of institutional betrayal. This matters." "To who?" Marcus asked bitterly. "These men are dead. Their families probably don't even know about this place. What difference does it make now? It makes a difference because stories like this change policy." Reyes leaned forward, her voice intense. "I've seen it happen. A reporter breaks a story about veteran mistreatment, and suddenly there's funding for programs. Suddenly there's oversight. Suddenly people care." She gestured at the dog tags. "These men can't speak for themselves anymore. But you can speak for them." Marcus shook his head. "I'm not a writer. I'm not a journalist. I'm just a guy trying to survive. You're a veteran who found evidence of systemic abuse of other veterans. That makes you exactly the right person to tell this story." She pulled out her phone, then grimaced when she saw there was no signal. "When I get back to town, I'm going to make some calls. I know a reporter at the state capitol, someone who specializes in veterans issues. If you're willing, I can put you in touch." The idea terrified Marcus in a way that combat never had. Going public meant exposure, meant attention, meant answering questions and facing cameras and being vulnerable in front of strangers. But it also meant giving voice to the silent. It meant honoring the promise he had made to himself on that first night in the chamber. "All right," he said. "Tell your reporter friend. But I want final approval on anything published. These stories get told right, or they don't get told at all. Deal?" Reyes stood and extended her hand. Marcus shook it. Before she left, Reyes turned back at the entrance to the chamber. "Merry Christmas, Marcus. I'm glad you're not alone up here with just ghosts for company." After she was gone, Marcus looked down at the dog tags still spread across the table. He wasn't alone. He never had been. These men had been waiting decades for someone to find them, someone to care. And somehow, impossibly, that someone had turned out to be him. The reporter arrived in mid-January on the first clear day after a week of storms. Her name was Jennifer Ortiz, and she came up the mountain in a four-wheel drive SUV, accompanied by a photographer named David Tran. Marcus met them at the gate, his guard up, ready to end this whole thing if they seemed more interested in sensation than substance. But Ortiz was professional and respectful. She was in her early 50s, with gray streaking through her black hair and the kind of direct gaze that Marcus recognized from his own mirror. This was someone who had seen hard things and refused to look away. The photographer was younger, quiet, letting his camera do most of his talking. "Thank you for agreeing to this," Ortiz said as Marcus led them inside. "Deputy Reyes told me what you found here. I've been covering veterans issues for 20 years, and this is unlike anything I've encountered." Marcus took them down to the chamber. Watching them see it for the first time, seeing the shock and then the anger on Ortiz's face as she began to understand what she was looking at, reminded him of his own first reaction. The photographer took pictures of everything, his camera shutter clicking steadily as he documented the space, the chest, the documents spread across the table. Ortiz read through the letters Marcus had prepared, studied copies of the journal entries, examined the dog tags and medals. She asked questions, dozens of them, taking notes in a worn leather notebook. How had he found this place? What made him buy it? When had he discovered the chamber? How many men were documented here? What patterns had he noticed in the denials? Marcus answered as honestly as he could, though he kept certain things to himself. His own service, his own struggles, the nightmares that still woke him most nights. This story wasn't about him. It was about the men in the chest. The interview lasted 4 hours. When it was done, Ortiz closed her notebook and looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. This is going to be a big story. National, probably. Are you prepared for that? For what comes after? I don't care what comes after, Marcus said. I care about these men being remembered. They will be, Ortiz promised. I'll make sure of it. The article was published 6 weeks later on the front page of the state's largest newspaper. The headline read, "Fortress of the Forgotten, Veteran Discovers Hidden Memorial to Abandoned Soldiers." Below it was a photograph David Tran had taken of Marcus standing in the chamber, surrounded by dog tags, his face shadowed but his eyes clear. The article was comprehensive and devastating. Ortiz had not only documented what Marcus had found, but she had independently verified many of the stories. She had tracked down descendants of the men whose names appeared on the dog tags, interviewed historians about Calloway's life, and contacted the Veterans Administration for comment. The VA's response had been bureaucratic and defensive, which only made the story more damning. Within 48 hours, the article had been picked up by national news outlets. Television crews were requesting interviews. Veterans advocacy groups were calling for investigations. Social media exploded with outrage and grief. And up on Black Ridge Mountain, Marcus's phone, which he had turned on for the first time in months, rang constantly until he finally shut it off again. But he couldn't shut out the world entirely, because the world was coming to him. The road up the mountain, barely passable even in good weather, suddenly saw more traffic than it had in decades. Veterans made the trip to see the chamber for themselves, to pay respects, to stand in a place that acknowledged what had been done to them. Historians came to study Calloway's journal and the documents in the chest. Journalists came to interview Marcus, though he turned most of them away. Deputy Reyes came too, not in her official capacity but as a friend. She helped Marcus manage the influx, screening visitors, setting boundaries, making sure he wasn't overwhelmed. And slowly, carefully, Marcus began to allow people into the fortress. Not to take anything away, but to witness. To remember. One morning in early March, Marcus was clearing snow from the courtyard when a truck pulled up that he recognized. James Cooper climbed out, and there in the passenger seat, ears perked and tail wagging, was Sergeant. Marcus's heart did something complicated in his chest, a combination of joy and pain that left him momentarily breathless. Cooper opened the door, and Sergeant jumped out, limping slightly but moving with purpose across the snow. The dog stopped in front of Marcus, sat down, and offered a paw. Marcus knelt and took the paw, and then, because he couldn't help himself, he pulled the dog into a hug. Sergeant's tail wagged hard enough to shake his whole body. "I saw the article," Cooper said, walking over. "Read about what you found here, what you're doing." He looked up at the fortress with respect. "This is important work." "It's something," Marcus said, releasing Sergeant and standing up. "I'm not sure how important." "It's important," Cooper repeated firmly. "I've been dealing with the VA for 6 years trying to get benefits approved for injuries I sustained in the service. Reading those letters in your article, seeing how long this has been going on, it made me feel less crazy. Less alone." That's what Ortiz said too. That knowing the history helps people understand it's not their fault. Cooper nodded. "Listen, I wanted to ask you something. I know you gave Sergeant back because it was the right thing to do, and I appreciate that more than I can say. But the thing is, he's been different since he came home. Restless. He keeps staring out windows like he's looking for something. He looked down at the dog, who was sitting between them, looking from one man to the other. I think he's looking for you. Marcus felt his throat tighten. Cooper, I can't take him back. He's yours. He belongs with you. I know that. And he is mine. But I was thinking, what if we shared him? Reyes told me you've been letting people visit the fortress, that you're trying to turn it into some kind of memorial. That's a lot of work for one person. What if Sergeant and I came up a few times a week to help? I've got carpentry skills, some electrical knowledge. And Sergeant, well, he's good company. Marcus looked at the dog, who was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes. Then he looked at Cooper, who was watching him with the same kind of understanding. This wasn't charity. This wasn't pity. This was one veteran offering help to another, offering partnership, offering the kind of respect that came from shared experience. All right, Marcus said. But I'm not paying you. Wouldn't accept it if you tried, Cooper replied with a grin. Some things are more important than money. Over the following months, the fortress was transformed. Cooper was true to his word, showing up 3 times a week with Sergeant and his tools. Together, he and Marcus began the slow work of making the place accessible without destroying its character. They repaired the roof, shored up dangerous floors, installed solar panels for basic electricity, and built a proper entrance to the chamber that was safe for visitors. Other veterans heard about the project and volunteered their time. A former Navy engineer helped them install a water purification system. An Air Force mechanic got Marcus's old truck running better than it ever had. A retired Army medic organized the documents in the chamber according to proper archival standards. They worked in companionable silence, or sometimes they talked, sharing stories that they couldn't share with anyone else. And slowly, imperceptibly, the fortress became what Calloway had always intended it to be. Not a hiding place, but a sanctuary. A place where the broken could come and be understood. Where the forgotten could be remembered. By summer, the chamber had been officially designated as a historical site by the state. A grant had been secured to properly preserve the documents and create digital copies for researchers. The Veterans Administration, under pressure from the media attention and advocacy groups, had announced a review of their claims process and new initiatives to prevent the kind of systematic denial that had defined the stories in Calloway's chest. None of it would bring back the men who had died waiting for help. But it meant something. It meant their suffering had not been meaningless. It meant the pattern had been broken, or at least bent. On the anniversary of the day he had first discovered the chamber, Marcus stood in the underground room and looked at the dog tags, now mounted on the wall in neat rows, each one accompanied by a plaque telling that veteran's story. Sergeant sat beside him, and Cooper stood on his other side. Behind them, a small group of visitors moved quietly through the space, reading the plaques, paying their respects. You did good, Cooper said quietly. Calloway would be proud. Marcus shook his head. I just told the stories. The men who lived them did the hard part. But you made sure they weren't forgotten. That counts for something. Later that evening, after the visitors had left and Cooper had driven back down the mountain, Marcus sat on the porch he had built off the tower room. The valley below was painted gold by the setting sun, and he could see Thornhill in the distance, its church steeple catching the light. Sergeant lay at his feet, content. The fortress was no longer haunted, Marcus thought. Or rather, it was haunted by the right things now. Not by fear or isolation, but by memory and purpose. The ghosts that walked these halls now were honored guests, their presence acknowledged and respected. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through messages he had been ignoring. There were dozens from veterans thanking him, from historians asking questions, from journalists requesting follow-up interviews. But one message caught his attention. It was from the VA, formal and official, informing him that his own disability claim, which he had filed years ago and which had been denied twice, had been reopened and approved. Marcus stared at the message for a long time. Then he looked down at the dog tags hanging around his neck, Robert Chen's tags, and felt tears sting his eyes. He had spent 3 years believing he didn't deserve help, didn't deserve to heal. But these men, whose stories he had told, they had taught him something important. Needing help didn't make you weak. Accepting it didn't make you a burden. It made you human. He reached down and scratched Sergeant behind the ears. The dog looked up at him with those wise brown eyes. "We made it," Marcus said softly. "We actually made it." And for the first time since he had come home from war, Marcus Webb allowed himself to believe that might be true. The fortress stood strong on its mountain, no longer abandoned, no longer forgotten. And in its tower room, a man who had been broken found himself slowly being made whole again, not through isolation, but through connection. Through the sharing of stories. Through the simple act of remembering. The ghosts were at peace. And so, finally, was he. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.